On the 13th of May 1935, T.E. Shaw, formerly T.E. Lawrence, known as Lawrence of Arabia, was returning from Bovington village, a mile away from his cottage of Clouds Hill. 400 yards from his home, he collided with two boys on bicycles riding in the same direction. He then slid along the rough road, ending his journey against a tree. He died 6 days later on the morning of the 19th of May as a result of his injuries. His inquest followed on the morning of the 21st, delivering the verdict of died accidentally from injuries received. That same afternoon, his funeral was held. And that would be the end of Lawrence's story were it not for one key fact: a black car. And the many, many questions that followed after it. Why did Lawrence collide with two boys who he knew were there on a road he knew well? Why was Lawrence positioned on the extreme left-hand side of the road? Why was the black car involved not seen after the crash? Why were the Secret Service on the scene immediately after the crash? Why were they already at the hospital when Lawrence arrived? Why, if Lawrence was a civilian, was a news blackout and lockdown implemented? Why was his home searched and documents removed? Why was the coroner pressurized to close the inquest quickly? Why did the boys' evidence seem rehearsed? Why were the witnesses' platoon mates not called to give evidence? Why was the evidence regarding the damage to the motorbike suppressed? Why was the inquest not adjourned to trace the car involved? Why are the post-mortem, hospital and police accident records missing? Who had the means, the motive and the opportunity to remove him? And who killed Lawrence of Arabia? Thomas Edward Lawrence was a scholar, military strategist, spy and author, best known for his activities in the Middle East during World War I. In 1914, Lawrence became a lieutenant in Cairo. With fluent Arabic, he worked with Faisal, leader of the Arab forces, in a guerrilla operation against the Turks. Aqaba was the first major victory for the Arab guerrilla forces, which was seized after a desert march. By the time the Arab army reached Damascus in October 1918, he was physically and emotionally exhausted and left for England 2 days later. On his return, Lawrence was made aware of the secret 1916 Sykes-Picot Treaty between the United Kingdom and France, which defined how they would control the Middle East at the end of the war. He also became aware of the Balfour Declaration, a public statement issued by the British in 1917 declaring its commitment to establish a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. Against the background of the Sykes-Picot Treaty and Balfour Agreement, Lawrence lobbied unsuccessfully for Arab independence at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919. In parallel, he worked on his war memoirs titled Seven Pillars of Wisdom. He became known as Lawrence of Arabia after his exploits were shown through the Lowell Thomas lectures. British officials regarded him as the enemy within, who stood in the way of Britain and France dividing the spoils of war. Lawrence was barred from the peace conference and was prevented from any further contact with King Faisal. In 1927, Lawrence changed his surname to Shaw. Posted to Bovington Camp in Dorset, he acquired Clouds Hill Cottage, which remained his home thereafter. Discharged from the RAF on February the 26th, 1935, Lawrence returned to Clouds Hill to face retirement at only 46. Lawrence had many different facets. How would he be described?
If I had to describe Lawrence in 3 words, I would say 1, he was principled. He was a man of honor and true to himself. Secondly, he was conflicted. He had allegiances with strange bedfellows that nobody else had. And thus, the 3rd way I would describe him was feared. Because of that, the British establishment did not know what to make of him.
Very complex, also very heroic, and I'd say in some ways indecisive.
Intelligent, courageous and principled.
Courageous, definitely. Also, I think, troubled. and ultimately tragic.
How was he viewed by the British establishment in 1935?
They knew he was a professional spy, but they did not know which side he was on.
I think he would have been viewed with suspicion. First of all, he'd just left the control of the RAF and the Military Act and the Official Secrets Act, and he was now on his own, a civilian, doing what he wanted to do.
As a double-edged sword, he was connected, he had skills, he had experience, and all of those things can be very, very good, but they can be dangerous if someone doesn't play by the establishment's rules.
Just considering the things that were going on at the time, I mean, the kind of uprisings that were about to happen in Palestine, the troubles, etc., I think he probably was seen as a dangerous person because he could never be trusted, really.
How was he viewed by the public and the press in 1935?
Well, the press were fascinated by him. The public too, in the sense that his war activity sort of mirrored the Rudolph Valentino movie activity.
His star may have faded a little bit. He'd been out of the sort of prominence of the early 1920s for a while, but still well known, well respected, well regarded.
Had that sort of rock star persona, the celebrity persona.
He was adored by the general public, who regarded him as a hero.
The general profile of him was a hero, but a mysterious hero.
David Lean's 1962 film Lawrence of Arabia did for Lawrence what Shakespeare had done for Henry V. However, the crash scene is very wrong. We see Lawrence riding at speed, coming suddenly face to face with the boys on their bikes, but on the wrong side of the road. Many of the film's fans regard its depiction of Lawrence as gospel, and to them it became exactly how the crash occurred. The boys travelling the wrong way. No black car, no witnesses, and on a tarmac road. The circumstances surrounding Lawrence's crash, just 11 weeks after his retirement, have raised many questions. Corporal Catchpole and his platoon mates saw a black car pass Lawrence moments before he lost control. However, the boys denied that they had seen any vehicle. Who was the driver of the black car, and why was the car never traced? Why did it not stop and the driver never came forward? Why was it not seen in Bovington after the crash? Why did the coroner open the inquest by directing the jury as to the accidental death verdict? Was the coroner under pressure to close the case? Why were the boys' testimonies at the inquest seemingly rehearsed? Why was the inquest not adjourned to trace the black car? Why were Catchpole's platoon mates not called to give evidence? Why would Lawrence have collided, trying to avoid the two boys, who he knew were there on a road that he knew very well? Why was he on the extreme left-hand side of the road? Why was George Bruff's evidence about the damage to the bike found on the handlebars and petrol tank suppressed? How were the secret intelligence services on the crash scene and at the hospital when Lawrence arrived? Why did they take over, implementing a lockdown of the press and hospital? Why was Clouds Hill searched, and what documents were removed? Where are the post-mortem hospital and police records? Why might Lawrence be removed, and who had the means, the motive, and the opportunity to remove him? On the 26th of February 1935, Lawrence retired from the RAF and cycled from Bridlington to Clouds Hill. Almost 11 weeks later, he was dead. Lawrence was rebuilding bridges with the Arabs, where an uprising in Palestine against the British and Jewish settlement was fermenting. He began to rebuild closer relationships with his friends, including Henry Williamson, who had built bridges with Oswald Mosley, and the British Union of Fascists, who had contacts with Hitler. Lawrence began to plan the publication of his book, The Mint, about squaddy life in the RAF. He was also also reaching out to old friends, including Winston Churchill and Lady Astor, about a future role in the intelligence services. Lawrence was unpredictable and was under surveillance by the Secret Service. The establishment feared where Lawrence might channel his considerable energies.
There's little doubt that after Lawrence's departure from the RAF in March 1935, when he's a free man, that he would still have been under surveillance. His bedfellows, his connections, the people he had alliances with, ran very deep and counter to what the British establishment was seeking for themselves. So he caused them a great deal of worry, and thus he certainly would have been under surveillance.
He was relatively young and still some sense of a need to atone.
Is there a reason for thinking he might have been under observation by British intelligence? Yes, I think so, because he was in communication with Henry Williamson, who was, if not a member of the British Union of Fascists, a supporter of the British Union of Fascists, and British intelligence must already have been concerned about the BUF because of the way in which relationships with Germany were deteriorating, and the last thing you would have wanted would have been somebody as high profile as Lawrence associating himself with the BUF.
He would have been, shall we say, watched, and there would have been efforts made to see where he was going, what he was doing, whom he was contacting.
He'd become a very famous man, but he had become out of control of the establishment as well.
While the authorities and inquest would have us believe it was a tragic accident given the events before and following the crash, there is an alternative and more compelling version of events: that Lawrence was assassinated. But who would have the motive to mount such an operation? Why would Lawrence have been removed? On the 13th of May 1935, Lawrence sent a telegram to writer Henry Williamson, agreeing to meet for lunch the next day.
I have this telegram, a parcel, and lunch Tuesday, Wetfine Cottage, 1 mile north Bovington Camp. Sure, yes.
A few days before, Williamson had sent a letter to Clouds Hill to see if Lawrence would act as an ambassador to meet with Hitler in an attempt to avoid an inevitable Second World War. It was a proposal that would have excited Lawrence, who had experienced the horrors of war. Williamson believed that Hitler didn't want a war with England to avoid another front. Lawrence had experienced the horrors of the First World War and came home with PTSD.
I think he saw so much horror. He lost his friends, he lost 2 brothers in the First World War. He would do anything to have stopped a second.
He seemed to me to be suffering from PTSD, and that after what he'd been through, it's hardly surprising. I think most normal people would.
I do think he had PTSD, although it hadn't been invented then. He would have seen and endured things that must have been very hard to write about in the 7 Pillars of Wisdom. For example, the attack on a retreating Turkish army, that would have traumatised him, which happened shortly after the sexual trauma of Derar.
It's a fact that after the First World War, he felt very kind of depressed, almost quite crushed, really, because of what happened and the role that he personally played in what happened. There's memoirs from his mother, for example, saying that he would sit in a room and stare for hours on an end, just staring into the void.
Hitler had strong connections to Oswald Mosley's Black Shirts. Unbeknownst to Lawrence, Williamson and Mosley, the British Secret Service had deeply penetrated the British Union of Fascists and were monitoring it. The idea of Lawrence meeting Hitler is not as far-fetched as it sounds. In the early days of Hitler's chancellorship, it was not unusual for the Führer to meet delegations from abroad. In 1935, Lawrence was a national hero. A meeting with Hitler would have been highly embarrassing to the British establishment. In 1937, the Duke of Windsor and Mrs. Simpson's visit to Germany was kept from the British public until 70 years later. Following the crash, Williamson discovered that the letter he had written was missing from the cottage, amongst a number of other documents. If Lawrence was trying to infiltrate the BUF or worse, join them, and potentially meet Hitler, this would have been a good reason to remove him. If Lawrence was infiltrating the BUF and feeding information back to MI5 handlers, at worst, he might have had a beating from Mosley's henchmen. The Nazis would have considered Lawrence a high-profile threat to a future war. If the Nazis had heard that Lawrence was being considered for a role in home defence, then whatever this role would have been, it is possible that they might have wanted to remove him. However, if Lawrence were to meet Hitler, this would have been valuable propaganda for the Nazis, and unlikely that Lawrence was really considered a threat.
If Lawrence had actually met with the Black Shirts, or God forbid, had met with Hitler, it would have changed the entire outcome of the war, potentially, because Lawrence was deemed to have been a pacifist. The British establishment wanted war. Hitler wanted peace. If he had met with Hitler, it could have changed the history of the entire world.
Lawrence's connections with Arabia in the First World War and as part of the Arab delegation during the Paris and Cairo peace conferences are well known. Lawrence blamed the Middle East's instability on the British government, stating the Arabs had exchanged one unloved imperial government for another, and that the British regime had a worse reputation than its Ottoman predecessor. The motive for the Arabs to kill Lawrence was simple. Following World War I, he had deceived them regarding the Sykes-Picot Agreement, thereby destroying their pursuit of Arab independence. However, Lawrence felt as deceived as the Arabs had been. To salvage the situation, he worked hard to reach a suitable settlement for his Arab friends at the Paris and Cairo peace conference. His friend Faisal had become king of Iraq. Iraqi oil was now in the control of the British. Squadrons of the Royal Air Force were stationed permanently in Faisal's territory, while Iraqi oil flowed steadily. Faisal had also been struggling with the growing number of Jewish settlers in Palestine and the growing discontent this had caused amongst Arabs. In July 1933, Faisal went to London, where he expressed his alarm at the current situation resulting from the Arab-Jewish conflict and the increased Jewish immigration to Palestine, and stated it must be limited. He had left London by air for his annual general medical checkup in Bern, Switzerland. A few days later, Faisal complained of stomach pains and died suddenly. With no post-mortem examination, suspicions arose as to the real cause of death.
But if we think about it, we've got King Faisal dying in 1933, shortly after his visit to London. Then Lawrence also again dying in very mysterious circumstances in 1935. Then shortly after that, you've got Azzeddin Qassam, who was killed by the British in 1935. And what do they all have in common? Well, I mean, they are all trained in guerrilla warfare, which at some point was very useful for the British, but suddenly it's not anymore because it's going against another promise, another pledge.
Faisal was becoming an obstacle, not only to Jewish immigration, but potentially, and more importantly, to the flow of oil. It was whispered he had flirted with American oil magnates. With a gathering storm of unrest in British Palestine, a reason for removal by the British or Zionists becomes clear. Lawrence was aware of this, but would have been unable to provide any serious input until February 1935, when he departed the RAF.
It's extremely likely that Lawrence was in touch with his Arabia friends and colleagues after he retired.
And would have been concerned about the settlement of Palestine that had frankly gone out of control.
And why wouldn't they? They were blood brothers. They'd been through so much and influenced each other's thinking.
And there's a gap, I think, in scholarship, in kind of research, looking at any communications he may have had with his Arab friends. Could these letters have been also intercepted? I mean, did they include things that the establishment did not want them, so I think it is a very interesting area of research, and we certainly need to look into that.
He had been communicating with Faisal's son, with Amir Abdullah of Transjordan and King Abdulaziz ibn Saud of Saudi Arabia, offering his support to an Arab uprising. Had Lawrence taken any part, it would have been public criticism of the British and its administration of Palestine. The British establishment would have silenced him in fear of losing control of the Arabs, their oil, and a backlash from the Zionists. A few months after Lawrence's death, the Arab uprising was put down violently by the British administration. The Zionists also had a motive to remove Lawrence, as they feared he would support Arab leaders in an uprising against the British administration of Palestine. Such a move would have made him a target for the British, with the Zionists benefiting from the action allowing Jewish immigration to continue. Indeed, Henry Williamson believed that Lawrence's death was the result of a Zionist plot.
Certainly the Zionists and the pro-Israelis of other types would have been very unhappy about Lawrence's involvement with the Arabs.
And I think if there was a suspicion that he was going to help any Arab uprising, which would occur in the year after his death in 1936, then yes, I think that would have been shut down.
Well, that would have worried global establishment or global political powers, because Zionism was cranking up. He would have been seen as a difficult figure in all of that.
I mean, the thing with Lawrence is you can never really guess what he could be up to, but I think it's very, very likely. And I think there are lots of incentives for him. I would say very kind of personal reasons and motives why he would have wanted to make things better.
The importance of Middle Eastern oil became more and more important. The need for a very loyal base in the Middle East, aka Israel, become more and more important. And in fact, I think said way back when the British warships changed their fuel from coal to oil in 1914, I knew we'd be in. So all the time he was aware that it was all playing for oil.
I would think most likely that it was the Zionists and the Israelis who, as we can see in the news today for what's happening in Gaza, can, at their most extreme, be totally ruthless.
While we are not aware of any communications between Lawrence and the Arabs, that is not to say there were none. Any communication with the Arabs would have increased the consternation of the security service. Lawrence's communications would not only have been intercepted, any that were at Clouds Hill would have certainly been removed following his death. While the Israelis did have operatives stationed in Britain, it is more likely that they would have contacted British Zionists and the intelligence service if they had concerns, and would have outsourced any action to British intelligence. The Mint is a book written by Lawrence but published 20 years after his death in 1955. It describes his time in the Royal Air Force as an ordinary aircraftsman. The book is notable for its sharp observations, its gritty content, and the insight it gives into the rough life of an RAF recruit. In 1935, he was planning to print the book on a press at Clouds Hill. A limited edition was published in the United States in 1936 under Lawrence's pseudonym. Following a discussion between the British Foreign Office and the Library of Congress, it was agreed to suppress the publication by making only 10 copies of these available for sale at a prohibitive price of $500,000 each. The Mint's publication would have revealed the harsh treatment of recruits by the officer class. Publication in 1935 would have disturbed the British Armed Forces, as its content would adversely affect recruitment at a time when a war was just a few years away.
It was believed that the content of Lawrence's book, The Mint, was going to be very damning to the government. In fact, they even kept a secret file called the precautions against the publication of the Mint.
Very frank writing on life in the RAF, which might have been quite difficult for a lot of his fellow servicemen.
They were really worried about it, and thus, when Lawrence died, the Mint sort of disappeared and was published 2 decades later. We may never know what the unabridged, uncensored version really had to say.
We must also include Winston Churchill as a suspect. While Churchill regarded Lawrence a friend, he was also ruthless and defended himself and his class strenuously. If Lawrence was moving towards an appeasement stance, Churchill, under pressure from patrons, would have viewed this as an obstacle and may have decided that Lawrence needed to be removed. There is also the intriguing possibility that Lawrence had been a confidant of Churchill in the 1920s. There were even plans to publish an updated 7 Pillars of Wisdom, which potentially contained a chapter about Churchill himself, which posited that he may have hastened his mother's end. We therefore have 4 reasons why Churchill may have wanted to rid himself of Lawrence, even though he was a friend. Firstly, his potential meeting with Hitler through Lawrence's connection with the Blackshirts and his anti-war stance. Next, his growing support of the Arab cause. And finally, that he had damaging information about Churchill, which he might publish. Churchill was ruthless. He was a man resigned to cause the loss of life of many if it protected his position or his class. His view on Arabs, Indians, Africans and others were racist and would have been viewed with disgust by Lawrence. Churchill met Lawrence at least once in the weeks before his death. Following that meeting, Churchill may have raised more red flags in the halls of Whitehall and the Secret Service. And while he didn't pull the trigger, he may have been another adding weight to the scales against Lawrence.
Churchill, for me, is a little bit of an enigma. Of course, he has a reputation as being the hero of the Second World War, but Churchill has quite a dark background. There were rumours that he got rid of his mother. There are certainly his behaviour during the war, in which millions of Bengalis died because of starvation, because he wouldn't allow food to get into India, was a huge issue. There was also genocide in Kenya.
Well, I wouldn't put anything past Winston Churchill. As to motive, of course, Churchill was really pushing what was a minority position in the British establishment for a more assertive position against Hitler and against German rearmament. So if Lawrence had been perhaps more sympathetic to Hitler, then that might have been motive.
History books will tell us that Churchill and Lawrence were friends. However, there's more than meets the eye. Churchill was greatly upset at the rumors that Lawrence was going to meet with Hitler. Churchill had made a promise to the Rothschilds to go to war. And it appeared as though Hitler and Lawrence wanted peace. Churchill knew the allegiance that Lawrence had to the armies and the people that he had served. Now, this was flying in the face of the Zionist backing that Churchill was accepting to go to war. So there were multiple reasons why Churchill would have been very much of the view that this man needs to be removed from the scene, because he could really throw a spanner in all the plans of the British establishment.
Research by Dorset historian Rodney Legg held that Lawrence was to become director of a combined secret service, to put it onto a war footing. The directorate would be an amalgam of security services, including special branch and police. In a letter, written 5 days before his crash, Lawrence wrote that something important was going to occupy his life from Friday the 17th of May 1935. The weather had kept me outdoors from dawn till dark and sent me dead beat to bed, but that ceases in 10 days. Colonel Meinertz-Argen's Middle East diary confirms that in May 1935, Lawrence led a review panel to restructure the intelligence services. Lawrence discussed this with Churchill and others in London in March 1935. Evidence of his commitment came on the 12th of May, the evening before the crash. His friend, Pat Knowles, said that Lawrence had planned to start up a printing press, but this would be deferred as Lawrence was expecting to undertake work of national importance. Nonetheless, in whatever capacity, Lawrence would have been seen as unsuitable.
When the world thinks that Lawrence has retired from military service, he's making covert meetings in London. And that's very suspicious. So either he's still a member of the British intelligence services, or is about to become, perhaps, as the rumor had it, the leader of the intelligence services under Churchill.
So what that meant was the coordination of all the intelligence services. In that case, Vernon Kell, who was the head of MI5, would have been subservient to Lawrence, and that would not have been accepted by Kell.
Major General Vernon Kell, a founder and head of the intelligence services since 1909, would have considered him a threat. Lawrence would become his superior, and Maxwell Knight, the head of operations, would have raised red flags about his fascist and Arab connections and rumours of his sexuality. Vernon Kell founded MI5 in 1909. By 1935, Kell had built the organisation with limited resources to a considerable network, including surveillance of communist and fascist groups and persons of interest, which included Lawrence.
He was extraordinarily powerful as a thinker. He was also very capable of being unscrupulous when necessary.
Maxwell Knight was the organisation's director of intelligence, compiling dossiers on its enemies. This information was then passed on to Vernon Kell. By the mid-30s, the British government had begun to doubt the competence of the leadership of intelligence services, and Churchill was especially critical. They were substantiated rumours that Lawrence, having left military service, would apply his talents to home defence. Firstly, this could have been to coordinate the gathering of military intelligence in preparation for war. Kell would have become a subordinate of Lawrence, who had skeletons of a potential sexual nature in his closet, which was unacceptable to Kell. Secondly, there was the possibility that Lawrence was supporting the Arabs in readiness for an Arab uprising. The pressure on the British from the Zionists would have been heightened. If the Arab uprising had spread to other Arab nations, Britain's access to oil during the coming war would have been highly limited, and the war would have been lost. Thirdly, there was the possibility that Lawrence, to try to stop a war, would meet Hitler, an action intolerable to the intelligence services, Churchill, and the establishment. We should also consider the effect publication of The Mint would have had on pre-war recruitment. Lawrence's reputation for being unpredictable and a loose cannon would have had a number of groups on edge. Intelligence services, Zionists, Arabs, and the British establishment. When he left the RAF on the 26th of February, he was under surveillance, and his days were numbered.
Who had the motive to kill Lawrence? Who didn't? This man was a rebel. And during his tenure in the British military, he was completely ungovernable. And now that he was free, even more so. So who could have killed him and why? You have to start, I feel, with Churchill. Although they're friends, it's really clear that Lawrence has some dirt on Churchill. He's going to add a chapter to the 7 Pillars, his famed book. Churchill doesn't like that. Churchill's also backed by the Rothschild to go to war with Germany and the rest of the world, bring the US into it. Lawrence is a pacifist. How about the Arabs? Well, there was a time when the Arabs loved Lawrence, and Lawrence certainly loved them. But the British government held Lawrence out to dry and didn't fulfill the promises that he had made to the Arabs. Rather, the British establishment took care of themselves and their allies, France and others. Then you have the Zionists. The Zionists know about the Arab uprising that Lawrence was part of, and that's a threat to their plans for Palestine. Then you have Kell, who, rumor has it, Lawrence is being positioned to take his job, a job he's had since the conception of the organization of the Secret Services, which he would keep for 31 years. Then you have the Nazis. The list goes on and on and on.
Certainly any one of those could be a motive. A combination of them probably would be, especially the connection with the black shirts.
There may have been black shirt motivations. There may have been something to do with the possibility of his visiting Hitler and of preventing that at all costs. It may have been that the Secret Service felt he was a liability and a danger to British security. It could well have been someone in an Arab group or a Zionist group, so we could look at half a dozen possible motives by different groups from different directions. Was it someone, perhaps, who didn't want to see him promoted as head of the new proposed Secret Services?
But I have to ask myself, who is better suited and better equipped to assassinate a spy than the organization that manages the spies? And that was managed by Kell.
Lawrence, the loose cannon, now out of military control, was now a target. He would have begun to suspect that he was a thorn in the side of those who traced his movements and intercepted his letters. Kell, Knight and MI5 would have regarded him as a subversive, a rebel, a threat, the enemy. There were a number of groups who may have had a motive to remove Lawrence. However, there was only one group who had the means, motive and opportunity and the resources to assassinate Lawrence. This was MI5, led by Kell. All MI5 needed to do was to watch and wait until immediate action was required. The final straw was Williamson's letter regarding a meeting with Hitler, his communications with the Arabs, threats to the Zionists' plans, the publication of the Mint, and the possibility of Lawrence leading an intelligence directorship all added additional weight. The combination tipped the balance, and the word was given. MI5 would choose the right moment, perfect the plan, and have teams trained and ready. Their target was being watched day and night. They could devise an operation and choose the time, place, and method.
I think it's very likely that Lawrence was assassinated. I think that he was still active as an intelligence officer. I don't think you ever truly retire from the profession. And I think that the circumstances of his death, the strange elements of the investigation and the inquiry, all point to this being a murder, not an accident.
There is no doubt in my mind that Lawrence was assassinated. He was a marked man. He was a rebel. He was a spy by profession. And thus nobody knew who his allegiance was with.
He was assassinated by the Secret Service, by Kell, by Maxwell Knight's B1 section under the orders of Kell. But as to the motive is more muddy. Was it because of the Arabs, or meeting Hitler, or the Mint, or the directorship? One cannot say.
But I believe there are many motives and reasons for many of his enemies to get rid of him. He was a dangerous man. He was not to be trusted. He would any minute flip and take the other side. And that gave ample reason.
The intelligence services had many opportunities to assassinate Lawrence. However, Lawrence was also under the watch of the press, and he had a considerable public profile, regarded by many as a hero. An assassin's knife, bullet or poison would have been highly suspicious and would have led to very ugly newspaper and newsreel headlines. Such methods leave loose ends, and Lawrence would have been dead long before May the 13th if there had been an alternative.
All of those methods would have led to some very, very awkward questions on the front pages of newspapers, and it would have aroused public suspicion.
When we think about road accidents, they are more, shall we say, acceptable in publicity as accidents, rather than had he been found shot, or had he been pushed off a cliff, or had he drowned. The motorcycle accident has more chance of being accepted by those who hear about it as being an accident.
A hero's death in a crash is much more acceptable. They knew that he would probably not die outright, but once they got him to the hospital, they had a possibility of poisoning him or giving him an injection of insulin, which they were experimenting with at the time.
Well, some things are harder to cover up than others. A road traffic accident is rather easy to pull off and cover up, for the simple reason that they happen all the time.
Lawrence's movements were well known. He rode a motorcycle at speed and lived on a remote lane. An accident would be credible and would be seen as a tragic end of a hero. It would be easy to give Lawrence a glancing blow at speed with a motor vehicle, sending the motorbike out of control, leading to fatal injuries to a rider not wearing a helmet.
The number of motorcyclists who, before helmets became compulsory, were killed, it's a head injury that kills you.
Even if Lawrence survived, he could be guarded and his death hastened if there was any possible chance of survival.
You've been looking at the evidence regarding the motorbike.
Yeah, it's really interesting. You know, Lawrence was an incredibly experienced motorcyclist. He knew the boys were on the road ahead of him that day, and without a vehicle, he'd have swerved to avoid the boys and overtaken around them without any trouble at all, as long as there's nothing in his path. If there hadn't been anything in Lawrence's path, the approach and overtake to them wouldn't have been a problem. We know that the boys would have heard the motorcycle coming from perhaps a mile behind them, because it's a loud motorcycle, V-twin 1000cc bike, and we know from their own testimony they heard it coming and they moved over to the right. With the car blocking Lawrence's path, he could either have driven off the road to the left, but he knew he'd probably lose control of his bike and he'd avoid this. In the event, he only had a very narrow space available to go between the boys and the car. He would have braked, but of course hit the rear of the boys on their bikes. The S-shape of the boy's back wheels shows he probably hit it slightly from one side.
Do you think, given the damage to the bike, that Lawrence was hit by the car?
Well, if we take a look at the damage to the bike, and the evidence from George Brough, who said the bike seemed to have been struck by something. Well, we've got damage to the front light, the front mudguard, the handlebar, where black paint was found incidentally. Petrol tank was dented, the exhaust dented in 2 places, all damaged on the right-hand side of the bike. You can see here all the damage points on the bike. Given Brough's examination, we conclude that the car glanced the bike, damaging the handlebars and petrol tank, and leaving the black paint found by Brough.
So you think that the damage to the bike is consistent to it being struck?
Yeah, I think so. I think maybe even if the bike was only nudged, it would have been enough for Lawrence to have lost control of the bike.
How do you think the front brake cable snapped?
Well, I think it's probably the force at which Lawrence used the brake lever.
And why do you think the wheels locked on the bike?
Well, it's just due to the panic in the situation, I think. Lawrence grabbed for the front brake, which is an instant response for any motorcyclist. It didn't have the power to stop the bike, but it broke the cable. The rear brake is much stronger. He'll have stood on that brake, locking the rear wheel completely.
And Lawrence's injuries, being thrown from his bike at perhaps 30 miles an hour?
Yeah, that's consistent with him being thrown forward and over the handlebars. His head would have hit the road very quickly, within the second probably. His chance of survival would have been very low without wearing a helmet. With a helmet, he could have saved him from fatal injury.
So do you think the assassination plan of nudging or striking the bike could have been put into action fairly simply?
It's so simple, it's almost ridiculous. As a motorcyclist, you're very vulnerable. And I would think if any group were going to try and assassinate Lawrence, the absolute obvious thing is to catch him out on his motorcycle. They'd simply have to have waited for Lawrence to return from Bovington village and encroach onto his side of the road. With or without the boys actually on the road at that time, it would have been very simple. So, Mark, I understand you've been trying to work out how the vehicle may have left the crash scene.
Yes, one of the problems I had was trying to explain why the black car wasn't seen in Bovington. Mm-hmm. And that suggests it left the road, and naturally the assassins would have had an escape route. So, reviewing the maps, you can see the road. Lawrence's direction of travel is shown as the black arrow, with the car travelling in the opposite direction, and the crash site is circled in blue. Just a few metres to the south there is a road which in 1935 would have been easily passable. Seconds after the crash, the car would veer to the right onto this road that went through Morton Plantation, off towards Morton Village, and then onto the road to London. That was their escape route.
The black car instigated the accident that led to Lawrence's death, and certainly it would have been seen in the community, it would have been seen in Bovington, right? But it wasn't. And that's because these are professionals.
It would have been damaged. So they had an escape route, and that's why the car was never seen in Bovington.
The callous and brutal murder of a nation's idol became a tragic accident, a hero's death. Who had the means to implement an infallible plan, cover it up, leaving no loose ends, and control the final chapters of inquest and funeral? There was only one organisation who could successfully carry out such an operation: the Secret Service. Monday the 13th of May 1935. It's a fine day and Lawrence had already planned to visit the post office in Bovington. He has a parcel of books to send to a friend and a telegram for the writer Henry Williamson in reply to a letter Williamson had sent 3 days earlier. The letter went missing from Clouds Hill following the crash, taken along with other documents. Williamson stated it said, "The new age must begin. Europe was ready for peace. You are the natural leader of that age in England. I'll call in anyway on Tuesday, probably around 1 to 2 p.m. At 11 o'clock, Lawrence mounted his Brough Superior motorbike and rode to Bovington, a little over a mile away. He parked, took his parcel of books from the saddlebag and crossed the road to the post office. He wrote out the telegram to Williamson at 11:25. Williamson, Shallowford, Filey. Lunch. Tuesday. Wet. Fine. Cottage, 1 mile north, Bovington Camp, Shore. He then went to Dodge & Company Butchers and brought pork chops for Albert Hargraves, the butcher's boy, and his friend Frank Fletcher to deliver on the same road Lawrence would take. Lawrence undertook other errands, but talked with soldiers at the camp and then walked back to the Red Garage, mounted his Brough Superior and rode off at about 11:30. Fletcher and Hargraves were already on the road ahead and were cycling abreast, with the wind carrying the sound of the Brough towards the boys, who moved into single file. Corporal Ernest Catchpole had been working all morning at the camping ground. Catchpole was standing by the fence of the army camp, smoking a cigarette, talking to 2 soldiers from his platoon. As Lawrence approached in 3rd gear, he would have been travelling at around 40 miles an hour. Lawrence changed down to 2nd gear to pass the boys safely. Catchpole could hear the sound of a motorcycle approaching from Bovington Camp at the same time as the sound of a car coming from the opposite direction. Car, a private black 4-seater saloon, passed him at speed, travelling in the opposite direction to Lawrence and the boys. Moments later, Lawrence swerved out of control.
The damage on Lawrence's motorbike is absolutely consistent with a bike that was struck in a collision. Now, this is plain to see for anyone who has eyes, but when you have the manufacturer of the bike look at it, you can see that there's severe damage to the petrol tank, the right handlebar, both of which have black paint stains, and a dozen other impact marks on the bike.
I would have thought that from damage that I have seen personally on my bike and on other bikes, something definitely hit that bike.
Lawrence must have seen Hargraves, swerved to go round him, but it was too late, and Lawrence's front wheel hit Hargraves' rear wheel. Lawrence pulled suddenly on the front brake and it snapped.
Braking on the older bikes, like the first ones I rode back in the 50s, it was not good. That you can so easily snap a brake cable.
Lawrence was then catapulted over the handlebars. Half a second later, his helmetless head smashed against the road surface about 5 yards in front of the bike. He slid before coming to a stop where his head struck the tree. The Bruff continued, spinning northwards down the road, stopping a few feet beyond Lawrence. Hargraves was knocked unconscious, while Fletcher fell off where he could see Lawrence leaning against a tree. Catchpole ran across the heath to the scene to tend to Lawrence. Moments later, an army lorry took Hargraves and Lawrence to Bovington Military Hospital. Captain Charles Allen received Lawrence and Hargraves at Bovington Camp Hospital at about 11:45. Intelligence officers were already at the hospital, suggesting a premeditated plan, and guarded the unconscious Lawrence. Catchpole, every soldier on the camp and civilians connected with the crash were ordered not to talk about it. Lawrence, fatally injured, now fought a desperate fight for life for the next 6 days. Lawrence was x-rayed, which revealed multiple skull fractures and a severely lacerated brain. Everybody at the hospital had been given orders not to say anything about the crash. The site was guarded by military police, and the hospital was instructed not to give any information. Personnel were ordered not to talk to the press for fear of breaching the Official Secrets Act. A military officer issued the false statement that there had been no witnesses to the accident. Lawrence was guarded by 2 Secret Service agents, one sitting by his bed and the other in a cot outside the door, while the nurses were ignorant of their patient. Reporters trying to gain entry to the hospital were told to leave as they were trespassing on War Department property. All military personnel, soldiers, wives, police constables were ordered not to say anything about the accident. All news came through the War Office. The boys, Fletcher and Hargraves, were interrogated a number of times following the crash. Lawrence's cottage was searched by the Secret Service. Letters and documents were removed, including the unpublished The Mint and Henry Williamson's letter that Lawrence had replied to with his final telegram.
When the Secret Service came to Clouds Hill right after the accident, they would have taken a number of documents. For a start, there was the uncensored The Mint. Now, this is a story about life in the RAF. They would have taken a letter from Henry Williamson. So this is very incriminating. And this is one of the last things that Lawrence did, was respond to this letter with a telegram saying, yes, I think I'd like to meet with you and talk with you about your idea of my meeting Hitler. So all those documents and more were taken by the Secret Service.
From the 14th to the 19th of May, Lawrence lingered in a coma. But just after 8:30 on Sunday, the 19th of May, his pulse stopped. Captain Allen entered the waiting room where friends and others were gathered and said, "It's all over now." A post-mortem examination was conducted, and Lawrence's body was taken in the gently falling rain to the mortuary, where he lay until the funeral. 2 days later, on the 21st of May 1935, the inquest into Lawrence's death was held in Bovington Camp Hospital. The inquest is perplexing. A civil inquest held in a military establishment was subjected to security restrictions. Many have suggested the whole proceedings were stage-managed. Indeed, the coroner received a telephone call from a senior government figure on the morning of the inquest who directed him to wrap things up quickly.
The coroner was pressurized to close the inquest as quickly as possible due to the high-profile nature of Lawrence and the desire to make sure that the rumors that were spreading about his assassination were nipped in the bud.
Coroner's inquests much more difficult to control, much more problematic. The British government often avoids them if they can. If they can't, then pressure might be applied.
It would seem to me that somebody, if I use government in inverted commas, somebody with very great power of organisation and control, somewhere in Whitehall, wanted the inquest and the subsequent funeral all done, disposed of, out of the way. I mean, he made the point at the start of it, after this pressure was put on him, the verdict is accidental death, now let's get on with the evidence, which is a complete reversal of the normal events. And that's what I think lay at the back of it. Somebody of immense power ordered the coroner to do it in that way.
The family story is that the coroner received a telephone call from a very high-ranking member of the British government telling him to get the inquest over and done with.
Churchill and other luminaries were expected to arrive by special train for the funeral in 2 hours, and the proceedings had to be completed by then. Ralph Neville-Jones, the East Dorset coroner, had greater powers than he would today and directed the jury towards its final decision at the start of the hearing.
Now, once you've heard all the evidence, it will be for you to bring in your verdict. As to the actual cause of death, you'll hear evidence today, medical evidence from Mr. Hugh Cairns, the neurosurgeon who carried out the post-mortem examination, and your verdict will be in accordance with that medical evidence heard.
In his opening address, Neville-Jones prejudiced the jury by implying he had already made up his mind as to the verdict. Neville-Jones's statement then called Captain Charles Allen, who presented the medical evidence.
Now, the deceased remained unconscious until his death at 8 a.m. on the 19th May 1935. In my opinion, the cause of death was the fracture of the skull, lacerations of the brain, heart failure.
Special Branch had conducted interviews with a number of soldiers who had witnessed the accident, but only one, Corporal Ernest Catchpole, was allowed to speak.
I'm Corporal 758-1979 Ernest Catchpole, stationed at Tidworth. At about 11:20 a.m. on the 13th of May 1935, I was at Clouds Hill camping ground with my platoon. We heard the sound of a motorcycle coming from the direction of Bovington Camp. Just before the motorcycle drew level with the camp, it passed a private black car going in the opposite direction. The car was close to the middle of the road. I then saw the motorcyclist swerve across the road to avoid two pedal cyclists going in the same direction. The motorcycle swerved immediately after passing the black car going in the opposite direction. I would say the accident occurred 15 to 20 feet after the motorcycle passed the car. I then heard a crash, and I saw the motorcycle twisting and turning over and over along the road. I immediately ran to the road and called for help. I found the motorcyclist lying on the right-hand side of the road. His face was covered in blood, and I sent to the camp for a stretcher.
Fletcher and Hargraves' testimony followed.
I was riding at the front, and Hargraves was riding at the back. We were on the left of the road. When opposite Clouds Hill camp, I heard a motorcycle coming up from behind. I then heard a crash, and Bert's bicycle fell on top of me and knocked me off my bicycle. I got up and saw Mr. Lawrence go over the handlebars of the motorcycle and fall about 5 yards in front.
Did you see any other vehicles on the road at any point?
No, sir. There were no other cars on the road then. I did not pass a car from the time I left Bovington camp in the
Albert Hargraves replaced Frank Fletcher in the witness box.
Frank Fletcher was with me for company. Opposite Clouds Hill camp, I was riding 4 or 5 feet behind Fletcher and on the left-hand side of the road. No motor car passed me about this time.
Both boys' evidence appears to have been rehearsed. They would have been coached by Special Branch officers to ensure their stories tallied, and there was no mention of the black car.
Put yourself in their position. Hargrave and Fletcher would have been terrified when the British Secret Service approached them and their fathers and say, listen, we don't care what you saw. Here's the story that we need you to tell. And they would have done so for fear of repercussions. And sure enough, their testimony is wooden, it's forced, and it's not the kind of language or narrative that boys of their age would naturally tell.
Something very strange about the evidence. It was almost it sounded almost as if the two lads had learnt their lines to take part in a school play.
Given that the boys said that they had seen no vehicle, Catchpole was recalled and challenged.
None of the other witnesses observed a car. Could you have been mistaken, perhaps?
No, sir.
As to tracing the car, Inspector Drake stated that inquiries had been made in the district, but no other person than Corporal Catchpole could say that they saw a car.
We then have to ask, why was Catchpole's platoon mates not asked to present evidence? That is highly suspicious. There's no reason at all why that should be the case.
That really is very suspicious and very, very irregular. There's no legal justification for having one person act as the spokesman for a group of potential witnesses.
And normally at a coroner's inquest, if there was a piece of evidence like that, that would need to be investigated properly before the inquest could conclude.
You would have as many witnesses as you could, especially if there was some form of accidental death.
But even with all the publicity that the crash generated, the driver never came forward and it was never traced. Neville Jones presented a statement by George Brough, who had examined the bike, but was confined to confirming it was mechanically sound.
Here from the manufacturer, Mr. George Brough. On examination, no obvious mechanical fault was apparent.
50 years later, Brough stated that he found black paint on the right handlebar and petrol tank, and that the motorcycle had been struck by something black on the right-hand side. He also stated that the vehicle it had struck would have chafed along the side. However, Brough's expert evidence was suppressed. This alone would indicate that there was more to the crash than the authorities would admit. A conspiracy.
Another interesting aspect of the inquest is the fact that Brough's evidence as to the damage to the bike was never presented. That did not come out until 50 years after the inquest.
Again, that's extremely suspicious. Key expert witnesses on technical matters would normally be welcomed in any open inquiry.
Brough's evidence regarding the damage to the motorbike wasn't presented other than the motorbike was functioning as designed because it implicates that Lawrence was in a collision, and not just any collision, a collision with a black car, because the paints come off on the petrol tank, the paints come off on Lawrence's handlebar, and that would be consistent with Catchpole's story and would change the whole complexion of the investigation.
The only conflicting evidence is that with regards to the black car. Now, I don't think the car had anything to do with the accident. However, the fact that Corporal Catchpole there is certain that he saw it, there were no other witnesses to it, and the boys are adamant they did not see it. Well, it's all rather unsatisfactory, is it not?
Neville Jones stating that conflict between the evidence of Catchpole and the boys was unsatisfactory is certainly an understatement. Any inquest should have been adjourned for the police to trace the black car at the least.
The question is, why would the inquest not have been adjourned to trace, to investigate the black car? It's the smoking gun in this story.
In an inquest today, had a mystery vehicle have killed somebody, it would have been behooving on the police to trace the car.
I think because they knew exactly who was in the black car and they wanted to keep it a secret.
That Neville Jones did not is astounding. So, with all the witnesses and evidence examined, Ralph Neville Jones summed up and the jury quickly returned the verdict they had been directed to.
The proper verdict to bring in would be one of accidental death. Death caused by injuries sustained accidentally. And needless to say, I completely concur with your verdict. The inquest is therefore adjourned.
Catchpole's testimony became notorious, and the press, much like the present day, undertook a hatchet job on him. Catchpole's courage in the face of pressure suggests that his testimony had more integrity than has been conceded. He would have had Secret Service and his commanding officers encouraging him to change his statement under threats and intimidation. Some said he was lying or sought attention. But what reason did he have to lie? A witness of Catchpole's integrity did not invent stories, and he stuck by his truth to his dying day. Following the trial, he was posted to Egypt, where, in July 1940 in Cairo, he committed suicide, shooting himself in the head in his bunk. One element never considered is the evidence of Lawrence as an experienced motorcyclist. He knew his bike and this road very well. Given that Lawrence was riding downhill towards the two cyclists, he would have seen them 500 yards away and would not have ridden into the back of them unless, of course, there was something which he needed to avoid. He would also have seen the black car approaching. We know with the motorbike in second gear he had changed down, slowing to negotiate the cyclists and oncoming vehicle on the left-hand side of the road. This positioning can only be for one reason: oncoming traffic. With no oncoming vehicle, Lawrence would have been able to give the bicycles a wide berth. Lawrence's action would indicate there was an oncoming vehicle and explain why he was on the left-hand edge of the road rather than the centre of the lane. There would have been perhaps 3 feet of room between him and the vehicle. Interference with the motorcycle would have been easy through a glancing blow which would have struck the handlebar and petrol tank, as Brough stated. The inquest left a plethora of unanswered questions. It ignored Corporal Catchpole's testimony. It didn't press the boys outside their prepared testimony. It made no effort to seek the car. It didn't allow George Brough to give evidence to the damage of Lawrence's motorcycle and did not fully explain Lawrence's actions. Any of these questions should have forced an adjournment in an inquest heard today. But with pressure on the coroner and a private train on its way from London, there was an imperative to wrap up the case.
It followed the death so quickly that it's very unusual, and somebody somewhere, somebody with immense power politically, was telling, just wanted the whole thing out of the way and was laying down the orders both to the coroner and to the church authorities who conducted the funeral.
On the 21st of May at 1 p.m, a few hours after the inquest, a special train arrived carrying the elite from London. Guests included Winston Churchill, Lady Astor, and many other notables. At 2 o'clock, St Nicholas's Church in Morton was packed with mourners. The service was simple, as per Lawrence's request, lacking any military pomp. The funeral route was lined by reporters and villagers, all wanting to be in the presence of the great man for the final time. One of the artefacts of the funeral is the newsreel. In 1935, an age before television, there was nothing more influential to sway public opinion than what millions saw in these newsreels in the cinema every week. The story was a tragic accident on a country lane. In this case, it was carefully stage managed. A big lie. Not so many years later, a man said, "The bigger the lie, the more it is believed." That man was Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels. There are therefore 4 potential scenarios for Lawrence's crash: an accident, suicide, survival, or assassination. Using the evidence of each scenario, a scientific approach called risk analysis can be applied to rate likelihood.
Risk analysis is the process of identifying potential issues. Here we're using it to assess probability. What is the probability of a particular scenario in Lawrence's crash? We will then apply 3 standard analytics: means, motive, and opportunity. Each score 1, 2, or 3 respectively. What you will see is that the higher the score, the greater the likelihood that the scenario is the correct one. Next, we have available evidence and historical context. Again, the higher the score, the more evidence was found to support the scenario and be the more likely in its historical context. Here we analyse what was happening historically with the benefit of clear hindsight. Finally, we have the probability of the scenario, how probable the scenario is. Simplicity of explanation is the scenario simple in its operation, and finally, past history, have those involved got previous experience of carrying out the scenario. We then multiply each rating together to create a final score. Based on the score, we can rate the likelihood of each scenario. As you can see, suicide and survival are both rated as highly unlikely. These can be disregarded. For example, we know Lawrence was talking about his future the night before the crash. For an accident option, the scenario is possible, as it did not include the explanation the black car, which we know from a number of sources, did exist. For the assassination options, we can see the theory that the black shirts, Nazis, Arabs or Zionists were involved is also highly unlikely, due to an absence of means, motive or opportunity. Churchill's involvement is more likely, but there's not enough evidence to support the facts. It is possible, but not high enough to be probable. What we can see here, by far the most likely probable option, deduced through this analysis, is assassination by Kell, an MI5.
Lawrence's involvement with the black shirts or the Arabs or publication of the Mint would have made things worse. Leading the directorship would have tipped the balance. Having left the army as an agitator and a civilian, he would have caused great consternation amongst the establishment. Action against him was inevitable, and the Secret Service would have executed it. Lawrence would have been under surveillance from the day he left the RAF in February 1935. From that day, he was no longer under the control of the military and would grow to be a potential embarrassment. MI5 would have a plan to assassinate Lawrence. We'll call it Operation Sirocco. Once a red line was crossed, a decision is made to terminate Lawrence and greenlight the operation. The order would have come from Captain Maxwell Knight, confirmed and directed by Kell. Maxwell Knight's unit would wait for the time and place. They would have been watching Lawrence and known his movements. They know that he visits Bovington on a regular basis, using a mile-long stretch of quiet, narrow, gritted road, barely more than a rough forest track. Letters have been intercepted which show that Lawrence was now a serious threat to national security. The trigger would have been Williamson's letter on the 10th of May suggesting a meeting with Hitler. The operation is green-lit for Monday the 13th of May. At about 10:30 in the morning, 2 units are in place. One team is in Bovington and another, the kill team, is close to Clouds Hill, parked in a gateway. At approximately 11 a.m, Lawrence leaves Clouds Hill for the last time and rides the 5-minute journey to Bovington. The kill team signal the Bovington team that Lawrence is on his way. He is an easy target on a remote, narrow road where they can use their car to push him off the road. Lawrence arrives in Bovington and runs errands, visiting the post office where he sends a telegram confirming the meeting to Williamson. After visiting the butchers, Hargraves and Fletcher set off immediately to deliver his order. Lawrence then talks to soldiers at the petrol station. He starts his bike, which is the signal for the Bovington team to contact the kill team, who know he will be intercepted within a few minutes. The car drives 150 yards from Clouds Hill so they can see and hear Lawrence's bike coming, their engine running. The driver is at the ready and the passenger is in the back seat. They hear the loud bike and can see Lawrence roughly 500 yards away, coming down the slope towards them. They can also see the 2 boys on bicycles 400 yards in front of Lawrence. The car moves off and Lawrence sees both the car and the boys ahead of him. The car begins its run towards Lawrence to intercept him. As Lawrence approaches the car and the boys beyond, he changes down to second gear, slowing to negotiate his way around the boys and the oncoming black car. He is on the extreme left of the road. With the car on his right, he can only go to the left. He doesn't have much room, but it is enough at the speed he is doing, roughly 30 miles an hour. We know this as the gear lever was stuck in second gear, meaning he could not have gone faster than 38 miles per hour. As the car approaches, it inexplicably moves to the centre of the road to force Lawrence off the road. As Lawrence negotiates his way past the car, the rear car door opens and glances the handlebars of the bike with an impact speed of roughly 60 miles per hour. Struck by the glancing blow, the Broth veers toward the boys, and Lawrence collides with the rear of Hargrave's bike.
He was an experienced motorcyclist, as I was, and he had also got a good safety record, and he had a very big, heavy, powerful bike in that Brough Superior, which is very, very good indeed.
He would have seen the boys off in the distance. So why did he collide with them? The answer is he was forced to. He was virtually attacked by a black car coming the opposite direction.
And there was something totally wrong about that accident. Now, it doesn't seem likely that he would have had the accident unless something had hit his bike.
He is obviously trying to avoid something. If he was simply on the extreme left and was going to steer around the boys and there was no black car, there wouldn't have been a problem. He'd have just ridden around them. Lawrence was skilled enough to be able to do that. But the fact that the car was there blocked any route that he had to get around the boys and get out of the way.
The circumstance of the accident, as analysed, do point almost inevitably to a collision with something that had been coming towards him and had knocked his handlebar across and catapulted him off.
The Brough is now out of control, but Lawrence is pulling desperately to the right. He is frantically braking with both back and front brakes. The force of the front braking causes the brake cable to snap. The wheel locks and he is catapulted over his Brough Superior. The speed and force of the crash sends Lawrence sliding down the road. His journey is stopped by a tree and he suffers severe, fatal head injuries. For the Secret Service, this element of the crash is not pure luck. They know that without a helmet, his injuries will be serious. They know that once in hospital, they can initiate an alternative end if needs be. Lawrence is fatally injured, and all they would need to do was watch, guard, and wait. Soldiers, including Catchpole, run from the camp and arrive at the scene. Catchpole can see that Lawrence's face is covered in blood, coming from his head wound. Immediately following the collision, the damaged black car has driven 50 yards for a few seconds. It forks off to the right onto a forest track and is now driving as fast as it can towards Morton and beyond, to a hiding place until it can be disposed of. This would explain why the vehicle was not seen in Bovington village. The B team await the arrival at Bovington Hospital of the ambulance. It arrives at approximately 11:45 a.m, where Lawrence and Hargraves are hospitalised by Captain Charles Allen. Military commanders close down the camp and Lawrence is guarded 24 hours a day. Officers, soldiers, nurses and other personnel are told that on no account should they discuss the patient or the accident. The boys' fathers are told to keep them silent. Catchpole is cautioned that he should not confuse matters by mentioning the black car. During the following week, the security presence in the camp is unprecedented. Intelligence officers arrive at Clouds Hill, where they carefully search the cottage for any sensitive documents and remove them from Clouds Hill. These will include Williamson's letters, the so-called Churchill chapter, drafts of the Mint, Air Ministry documents, papers about any future role in home defence and the intelligence services. Lawrence's condition is stable but serious. He is never left alone. Doctors continue to stabilise his condition, but it is quickly understood he only has a slim chance of survival. MI5 ensures his chances are zero. At approximately 8:30 a.m. on Sunday the 19th of May, Lawrence dies, and his body is carried to the camp chapel with an inquest and funeral planned just 2 days later. The two boys were coached in their stories. Catchpole and his platoon mates, witnesses to the crash, are questioned, and Catchpole is the only soldier allowed to give evidence at the inquest. Pressure is exerted on him regarding the black car, but he is resolute. George Brough inspects the motorcycle and finds black paint on the handlebars and petrol tank, indicating the bike had been struck by something. He was told he can only testify as to the condition of the motorbike. Early on the morning of Tuesday the 21st of May, the East Dorset coroner, Ralph Neville Jones, is contacted by a senior member of the government and told that the case should be closed with a verdict of accidental death. Opening the inquest, Neville Jones steers the jury of 7 towards this verdict. The boys' statements seem wooden and rehearsed. Their testimonies conflict, and they insist they had not seen any black car or any other vehicle. Catchpole is called and insists he had seen a black car, describing it as a saloon travelling at approximately 30 miles per hour. At the end of the inquest, he is recalled by Neville Jones and given a chance to retract his statement. George Brough only gives written evidence that the motorcycle was mechanically sound and is not allowed to present the damage he has observed on Lawrence's motorbike. Lawrence's own skill and his road actions are not examined. Neville Jones describes the conflict between Catchpole and the boys' evidence of the black car as unsatisfactory.
The boys are adamant they did not see it. Well, it's all rather unsatisfactory, is it not?
But makes no effort to adjourn the inquest to seek the driver. After a little over an hour, the jury deliver their verdict of accidental death.
Death caused by injuries sustained accidentally.
And the inquest is closed. Lawrence's funeral is scheduled for 2 o'clock that same afternoon. The plan the Secret Service implemented was premeditated.
I may have been born at night, but not last night. If you're wondering if the Secret Service was involved, then all you have to do is look at the evidence. For a start, what had Lawrence done that very morning? He had sent a telegram confirming his intention to meet with somebody who wanted him to meet with Hitler. That was 20 minutes before the alleged crash. Second of all, after the crash, the Secret Service are waiting for him at the hospital. Forget the fact that there was a black car cited by Catchpole and his colleagues and reported originally by Fletcher, although he later changed his story. There's also the report from the motorcycle manufacturer, the bike that Lawrence was riding, who noticed that there was damage to the petrol tank in the right handlebar and many other parts of the bike. However, those had black paint.
Anytime you see what the Americans would call a full court press with the media, the military, the intelligence, all coordinating with each other, that indicates something's up.
You have a media lockdown. You have a lockdown on the hospital. You have a lockdown on the crash site. You have a lockdown on every individual who was a witness to the scene. At the inquest, it's led by somebody who prejudices the jury before they even hear the evidence. And the evidence given by Hargrave and Fletcher is wooden. Two frightened boys saying what they were told to say. The whole thing stinks of a cover-up.
The letter that Lawrence responded to in his telegram to Williamson about a meeting and then a potential meeting with Hitler was the trigger.
It's very likely that the Secret Service was involved just because of who T.E. Lawrence was, where he was living, what he might have been up to, and also looking at the circumstances of the investigation, some of the peculiarities of that. They all point to Secret Service involvement.
The very fact that they were on the crash scene within minutes and were at the hospital waiting for him, to me, rings bells. This is very suspicious. And that the black car was never traced because the Secret Service knew if it was traced, We'd have to start asking questions.
You've got a D notice going out to the press to stop normal media reporting. You have elements of the investigation that seem to be covered up, in particular the black car and the scrape on the bike. You have conflicting evidence, and the whole thing is just sped along in a very controlled way. And that all indicates there's some level of secret, covert state involvement.
Yeah, I think that was right. I think that's what happened. I mean, why wouldn't they?
The aftermath of the crash, the close down of the hospital, the fact the Secret Service were there, the inquest, the funeral, all of those things were managed. They were controlled, and they were controlled because of the message. The Secret Service and the British government needed to get the same message out, which was Lawrence had died in an accident.
We shouldn't assume that there's any sense of fair play or decency or, it's all cricket. This is life and death stuff. And the British establishment, different factions within the British establishment, were facing war, global war. So in that context, the life or death of one man would have been measured against what they would regard as the greater good. So I don't see any reason why they wouldn't take him out.
Alex Younger, former chief of MI6, once said, "There is a mantra that surrounds Secret Service that reads, 'Our successes are private, our failures are public.' Lawrence's assassination was a Secret Service success, which attempts to remain private." Assassinations are carried out because of fear of change. For example, JFK, Mahatma Gandhi, Benazir Bhutto. There are many other potential deaths which have remained a mystery, including Robin Cook, Dr. David Kelly, Patrice Lumumba, UN Secretary-General Dag Hammarskjöld, and Princess Diana. Princess Diana's death has all the elements of an assassination. The similarity between Lawrence's death and that of Princess Diana is striking. Both Diana and Lawrence had a high public profile, continually running from the press, and their deaths caused an unprecedented outpouring of public grief. And both were killed in a recognised assassination technique, a motor accident.
There are far more unexplained deaths than the general public know about. A great many people suddenly cease to be, and for no apparent reason.
We can now re-examine our original questions. Lawrence collided with the boys even though he knew they were there, because he was forced from the road by the black car driven by Secret Service agents. And once one admits the existence of the black car, then one must admit there was a conspiracy to murder Lawrence. Lawrence was positioned on the extreme left-hand side of the road to avoid the car. Had the car not been there, he could have navigated around the two boys. The black car was not seen in Bovington because it left the road 50 metres after the crash, using its pre-planned escape route. The Secret Service were on the scene at Bovington Hospital when Lawrence arrived, as the operation was pre-planned.
Not only minutes after the crash, but before Lawrence makes it to the hospital, they're there. How can that be? Well, the answer must be that they are the ones who were involved in instigating the crash that led to his death.
A news blackout and lockdown were implemented because the operation was controlled by Secret Service to manage the media.
Despite the fact that Lawrence is not a member of the military anymore, there needs to be a lockdown. A lockdown on the media, a lockdown on the hospital, a lockdown on the crash site, a lockdown on all the eyewitnesses to make sure that even in that day and age, 1935, there's no social media. It's only the government word, and the government needs to make sure they tell the story they want to tell.
This is textbook covert operations behaviour. Clouds Hill was searched, Sensitive documents were removed, including communications with Williamson and those between Lawrence and the Arabs, plus drafts of the Mint and the so-called Churchill chapter. The inquest was stage managed. The coroner was pressurised to close the inquest quickly, delivering a verdict of accidental death and to ensure Lawrence's funeral was held and his story closed. No adjournment or effort was made to trace the car or its driver. The case would not have been closed in today's coroner's courts. The boys' evidence had been carefully rehearsed to ensure there was no mention of the black car and that they delivered the same evidence. Catchpole's platoon mates were not called to give evidence, such that Catchpole was the only witness at the inquest to confirm the presence of the black car. Bruff's evidence regarding the damage to the motorbike was not presented, as it would have confirmed the bike had been struck. The damage to the bike dovetails with witness evidence. Lawrence's behaviour as a motorcyclist was not examined. Had the car not been present, he would have been able to steer around the boys. The road was gritted track, narrow and unforgiving in a skid, and its condition did nothing to aid any evasive manoeuvres by Lawrence. In such conditions, a sudden swerve would be fatal to a cyclist without a helmet. Following the crash, events were stage managed by the Secret Service. Despite extensive searches, the post-mortem, hospital and police records are missing, unsurprising, to reduce the information available.
Normally, bureaucracies are very, very good at record keeping. It's basically what government does. So when things go missing, that has to be a massive red flag, and we ought to be suspicious.
These documents went missing because Lawrence was a beloved public hero. It was very fortunate for the British establishment that there was no social media at the time. The government controls the story the public wants to hear.
And such a man would have been more than capable in 1935 of passing orders to leading police officers and to the coroner's office and so on, and say, we require the following paperwork to be handed into X's office now.
In order to control the message, you have to remove police records, you have to remove hospital records.
I have to believe that somewhere there's evidence, there's records that were kept of the original interview with the boys, Hargrave and Fletcher, with the hospital records, with the police records from the crash, evidence of the black car, evidence of the motorbike and the damage that was done to it. Somewhere this is kept.
The motive to remove Lawrence was driven by the timing of him leaving the RAF and being out of military control. The crash occurred just 11 weeks after his departure. Lawrence was removed because of a potential meeting with Hitler, his communications with the Arabs threatening the Zionists' plans, publication of the Mint, and the possibility of him becoming leader of an intelligence directorship. Any of these would have been a threat. The combination made Lawrence's future unacceptable to the British establishment. On the 13th of May, 1935, T.E. Lawrence was fatally injured in a motorcycle crash on his beloved Brough Superior, ultimately costing him his life 6 days later. His death was an assassination by the only group who had the means, motive and opportunity to commit the assassination, the Secret Service, directed by Maxwell Knight on the orders of Vernon Kell. In the 21st century, we are more aware than ever of the sordid goings-on of the government and its intelligence services, and such assassinations around the globe are a daily occurrence. Litvinenko, Khashoggi, Franco, Kelly, the list is endless. In 1935, Secret Service activities were more covert. The idea that the state would assassinate a public figure and to lie to its citizens were unthinkable. Nowadays, we are wiser and more cynical. We know our leaders lie to us habitually. By May 1940, Churchill had become leader and had to take radical steps after the first 9 months of the war. The first was the restructuring of the intelligence services, which had been planned with Lawrence in 1935. Within days of becoming Prime Minister, he had removed Kell. Lawrence's murder was potentially the United Kingdom's first 20th century state-sponsored assassination by its Secret Service. A premeditated operation carried out in plain sight, undertaken by agents of the government for the people, to protect its interests of its allies and the establishment. It was a perfect plan. A military operation perfectly executed, wrapped up neatly and quickly with no loose ends. Only the Secret Service had the power, experience and resources to do it. Even after all the evidence, some would still dismiss this as a conspiracy theory.
Challenging orthodox history is inevitably met by cries of conspiracy theory, an expression used to discredit an opinion so that it need not be examined closely, and to demean the credibility of the speaker. But history is a continuing dialogue between the present and the past. There is no single eternal and immutable truth about past events and their meaning.
So, was Lawrence murdered? It's for you to decide. In light of current events, Lawrence is still very relevant.
I mean, looking at the region now, looking what's happening there, I think you'd be quite shocked and just, I think if you could change time, you probably wouldn't go back and be part of that, knowing what it ended up to be.
I think he would be unsurprised, but heartbroken. This was someone with a real profound, indeed spiritual connection to the region and its people. And I think he would see the suffering there, and he would see Britain's fingerprints all over it.
And I think Lawrence felt so betrayed, he would look back now and just have his head in his hands. He would have predicted what has happened now a century later.
It was all for oil, and the slaughter is completely unjustified. Be appalled. And I think had he lived, he would have done something to stop this. I can't see the invasion of Iraq or the current Mark II Nakba happening had Lawrence lived to make more influence on the world.
I have to believe that he would have said, if you listen to me, if you did what I was trying to do with the people I was working with and the relationships and allegiances I was forging, we wouldn't have these problems today. You've made a right mess of it, is what he would say.
In March 1921, at the Cairo conference, Lawrence said that the influence of a just policy, Arab opposition to Zionism would have decreased if it had not entirely disappeared. Lawrence was devastated when he found out Britain would not keep the promises he had made for independence in Arabia. More than a century later, Lawrence's just policy eludes the world, and we see the result every day on our TV screens.